afternoon.
Hi, is this Larry?
It is indeed.
This is Tommy from the Brothers Mysterium. How are you?
Hi, Tommy. We're doing fine. How are you guys?
Fantastic. Glad we were finally able to make this happen.
It's been a struggle, hasn't it?
It
Glad
has
it worked
been.
out, too.
Yeah, perseverance pays off. So before I start with the questions and stuff, could you just say your name and your credentials or title?
Sure. This is Larry Arnold. We're the director of ParaScience International, based in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Our background is in mechanical and electrical engineering, and we have investigated various Fortean phenomena, specifically known for our work in spontaneous human combustion for 4+ decades.
Awesome. So let's get this party started. My first question, for those listeners that might not be aware, what is spontaneous human combustion, or as we can call it to save time, SHC? What exactly is it?
That's a great place to start. Always best to start up front with the definition of the subject under discussion. Our definition of spontaneous human combustion, SHC, is the ability and phenomenon wherein a body will smoke, blister, or otherwise burn in the absence of a known, identifiable external ignition source or source of radiant heat. In what we call classic spontaneous human combustion, which is how history normally depicts the phenomenon, the body is reduced almost wholly to powder.
Very cool. And are you comfortable with the phrasing of that, spontaneous human combustion? Do you think that those words define what is physically happening?
In some cases, absolutely so. In other cases, we prefer something more erudite, more scientific sounding, such as the proposal we've made to call this phenomenon super hypothermic carbonization, keeping the acronym still available as SHC. One of the problems with the phrase spontaneous human combustion is that it invokes a lot of xenophobia among fire and medical professionals because it suggests something mysterious, not only mysterious, but supernatural. That's a huge psychological hurdle for an investigator such as ourselves to overcome. But given that background, history has put the label of spontaneous human combustion on this broad phenomenon, so we deal with it and live with it.
And what first made you decide that this was a field of study that you wanted to investigate more, write books on, look into? What, pardon the pun, sparked your interest into SHC?
What did spark our interest in making this a lifelong career? Great question. We were introduced to the concept when we were in junior high school by reading a book called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards. Some of your listeners may have encountered that book themselves. In that book, Frank wrote a chapter called Incredible Cremations and dealt specifically with the case of Mary Hardy Reeser, who in early July 1951 became a tinderbox in her apartment in St. Petersburg, Florida. The local officials at the time were utterly bumfuddled by what they encountered when they responded to the fire call. What Mrs. Reeser left behind was 1 foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, and a head that sit by the authorities at the time to have shrunk to the size of a teacup, baseball, or grapefruit, and an apartment that was otherwise devoid of significant fire damage. The fire that consumed Mrs. Reeser was relegated to an area about 3 feet in diameter, included incinerating the chair in which she was last known to be seated. Authorities looked for evidence of foul play. They could find none. They looked for evidence of an accelerant. Could find none. Mrs. Reeser was known to be a cigarette smoker, and so after a month it was determined that, she must have dropped a cigarette on herself and slowly emulated in her own body fat. But given that, we have to question initially why were they so perplexed for a month, and initially had ruled out such a simple explanation. We wondered whether Mrs. Reeser was a one-off, if you will, or whether there might be other cases similar to hers that would, suggest that something might be strangely afoot here. After we left mechanical engineering at Lafayette College, we turned our attention back to General Forteana and remembered this case that we read about in junior high school. Started to investigate further. We went to the Library of Congress, pulled up some microfilm from the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa Tribune, concurrent with the event dated to Mrs. Reeser's demise, and found that Frank Edwards had not made up the story, that his recounting in his book was completely factual. This indeed was front-page news in the summer of 1951 down in Florida. This is a true mystery. And we subsequently discovered a very similar case here in our home state of Pennsylvania that occurred several years later in December of 1966. When we got the facts of the case that surrounded Dr. John Irving Bentley's personal immolation and then got the fire photographs, we were just blown away because these photographs of Dr. Bentley's demise belied everything that we had studied up to that point.
Wow.
By looking at fire scenes depicted in medical and fire journals, and we can get into details of the Dr. Bentley case should you choose. It's an absolutely fascinating case. At this point, we concluded that there seems to be a real bona fide phenomenon here that mainstream science is ignoring. And having been brought up with a scientific methodology as our educational background and being innately curious, we decided to see if we could spend a couple of weeks at the Library of Congress and the College of Physicians in Philadelphia going through, medical texts to see if we could find any other cases of this phenomenon. Indeed, we did. And the result of that was our book, Ablaze, published in 1995, almost 20 years ago now, that document the scientific and historical evidence for hundreds of cases that fit the classic definition of spontaneous human combustion.
And now you kind of touched on this, something that's always irritated me. Why has the scientific, the medical community kind of ignored looking into this more? There are famous cases. You mentioned Mary Reeser, who I believe is known as the Cinder Woman. There are so many cases of this, and I don't understand how it can be so controversial, so debated. Is it something real? Is it not? Why do you think mainstream science sort of ignores these incidents?
Yes, you are correct that Mrs. Reeser was called the Cinder Woman at the time. And the question you raise about why mainstream science wants to ignore this evidence for spontaneous human combustion is one that has plagued and perplexed us as well for many a decade. Our answer to that, the best one we have come up with, is that the phenomenon is so perplexing, so bizarre, so challenging to what fire scientists understand about the behavior of fire and what the medical community understands can happen to the human body when exposed to a conventional external source of open flame, causes them to basically invoke xenophobia, fear of the unknown. This so deeply challenges and affronts their conventional wisdom and education that it's easier for them psychologically in general to simply ignore the evidence or to explain it away by means that simply do not make scientific sense.
Annoying, but you make a great point, but it is definitely frustrating that they, as you said, are sort of afraid to even entertain the idea or do research to explore it. What do you think are the causes of spontaneous human combustion? I know a lot of people have a lot of theories about, like you said, burning in your own fat, or people have natural gas within them and maybe that explodes, or it could be static electricity. What are your theories and findings on what could be a cause of spontaneous human combustion?
In our book Ablaze, we offer some 120 different theories as to how this phenomenon might occur. One of the challenges that our research has borne out is that the database of the many cases that we've been able to document are so diverse in their nature and presentation that we have been unable to come up with a single or even a few theories that apply broadly to what history presents to us as the mystery of spontaneous human combustion.
Right.
All the cases were alike. It would be relatively simple, at least to theorize a specific set of circumstances or a theory that can explain these bizarre human incinerations. We're not able to do that, which is why we have so many theories. You can throw out all the theories if you wish, come up with the 121st theory if you will. We're certainly willing to entertain that. It's easier to posit what doesn't cause spontaneous human combustion than it is at this current time to posit what does cause it.
Right.
It's been suggested by the debunkers that first and foremost, spontaneous human combustion is simply a claim born out of medieval ignorance or is a hoax. We have one medical examiner who purported to be an expert on the subject, wrote an article debunking spontaneous human combustion, and labeled the photographs that were shown to him at our bequest as hoaxes. And Dr. Adelson, the medical examiner in question, when asked why he arrived at the conclusion that these photographs of Dr. Bentley and Mrs. Reeser and other wholly immolated human beings in a fire scene that was otherwise devoid of significant heat and flame damage were hoaxes, his response was, quote unquote, these photographs are hoaxes because simply bodies do not burn this way. End of mystery. Right. Well, we know that the photographs were not and are not hoaxed. These photographs that he looked at were taken prior to the days of photoshopping, and we know the source, we know the provenance of the photographs. These photographs were taken by newspaper editors or fire professionals who clearly had no reason to, hoax these photographs. They depict real historical events.
Right.
Another explanation that you've alluded to already, that the debunkers so often invoke, is the so-called human wick theory, in which the body, once ignited externally, begins to burn in its own body fat, its own adipose tissue becomes the fuel for the fire. In other words, the body is, in essence, treated as an inverted inside-out candle, in which the victim's clothing becomes the wick, the person's fatty tissue becomes the fuel, and once lit externally, they slowly smolder over many, many hours in their own body fat. We've attempted to do this at the experimental level. We have failed to do so every time we've tried the experiment. You have probably seen, certainly some of your listeners have seen on television, certain experts who use pig carcasses as a stand-in for the human body.
Right.
Wrap it in a towel or sheeting, and in one case have doused it with gasoline to provide sufficient heating to begin the human wick process to unfold. What happens in those experiments is that the fire, if it self-extinguishes, leaves enough of the pig carcass left that you could easily identify it as a pig. You could do autopsies on what is left at the fire scene in the laboratory. Or the fire rages quickly out of control to the point that the burn chamber is at the verge of flashover. Fire suppression equipment is brought in to douse the raging inferno, and yet we will have the expert standing there saying, look, I replicated these localized fire scenes like we find with the Mary Reeser case or the Dr. John Bentley case, and we can dismiss spontaneous human combustion. Well, at the Reeser case and the Bentley case and hundreds of other cases that we've documented in our book Ablaze, we don't have fire suppression being done. These fires begin and end at the human body.
Yeah, that's something that always interested me, is that if somebody's sitting in a chair in their living room, only the person will burn. Maybe there's some scorching on the chair, on the ceiling above them, but it doesn't spread. So it's cool that you did some actual experiments to try to figure out what's going on there, and you were unable to create that effect. Another question is, are there different levels of this combustion? Is there ever a case where somebody, their arm burst into flames and turned to ash, but the rest of their body remained, or they lived, or maybe just a foot? Has ever been a half immolation, ever a survivor, anything along those lines?
That is a wonderful and very astute question, and the answer simply is yes. When we began this discussion with you, we referred to the concept of what we call classic spontaneous human combustion, which is what history has presented as the complete immolation of the human being by what appears to be fire or combustion. Mrs. Reeser, Dr. Bentley in northern Pennsylvania in 1966 are examples of classic spontaneous human combustion. One of the naysayers of SponCom says that the phenomenon is, quote-unquote, impossible because, quote-unquote, there is not one single instance in which internal organs are burned more completely than are outer parts of the body. On that basis, he submits that spontaneous human combustion is simply impossible because those conditions never exist. Well, those conditions do exist. Mary Reeser left behind, as we said earlier, a foot and a few pieces of calcined vertebrae, but no pancreas, no stomach, no heart, no liver. In other words, no internal organs. Dr. Bentley, when he consumed himself to powder, and we stress the emphasis on the word powder, we were being quite literal, dry, ashed powder, was what was left of Dr. Bentley's body, with the exception of one half of one lower leg, which revealed and proved that those ashes once belonged to a human being. He left behind ashes and half that lower leg, which would be an outer body part, but not one internal organ. So by the critique that the naysayers invoke to dismiss spontaneous human combustion, they themselves have proven that, as a concept, spontaneous human combustion is a real event.
And where in Pennsylvania was the Dr. Bentley incident?
Oh, let's get into good old Dr. Bentley.
Yeah, I think I'd like to explore this a little more.
It's a great case to explore. This is the one that really captivated our interest in the phenomenon and led literally to a life-changing career redirection. In December 1966, Dr. Bentley was a retired 92-year-old physician, general practitioner living in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. Coudersport is in the north-central tier of our home state of Pennsylvania, an area that at that time was largely rural. It was popularly said that there were more deer in Potter County than there were human beings. Dr. Bentley was beloved by the townfolk of Coudersport. Apparently was in good health, though several years earlier he had broken one of his hips, which had never mended quite properly, and he used an aluminum walker to motivate to his two-room apartment, which consisted of a sitting room and the adjoining bathroom. Here's the story of Dr. John Irving Bentley. On the morning of December 5, 1966, Don Gosnell, a local meter reader for the gas company, walked into Dr. Bentley's home on North Main Street in Coudersport to read the gas meter down in the basement. He held a customary friendly greeting to Dr. Bentley, and Mr. Gosnell got no response. Mr. Gosnell proceeded through the hallway to what he would later tell us was a sweet-smelling, wispy, light smoke in the air, descended to the basement with the gas meter down there, and then upon returning he noticed that in one corner of the earthen basement floor was a pile of ashes about 5 inches in height, about 14 inches in diameter. Mr. Gosnell, besides being a meter reader, was a volunteer fireman in the community. He was curious. He walked over to the pile of powder in the basement, kicked it with his work boot, and then looked overhead and noticed in the basement ceiling was a hole about 2 by 3 feet in diameter with cherry red embers on its perimeter. Don told us that he thought to himself, gee, there must have been a fire here overnight in Dr. Bentley's home. Wonder why we didn't get a fire call. Mr. Gosnell went back upstairs down the hallway to exit the building and yelled once again his customary morning greeting to the old doc. Got no response. Being curious, he opened the door to Dr. Bentley's two-room apartment. It was unlocked. Peered inside and did not see Dr. Bentley sitting customarily in the chair in the middle of the sitting room. Mr. Gosnell stepped further into the apartment, peered around into Dr. Bentley's bathroom, and yelled the understatement of 1966. Dr. Bentley's burned up. What he first thought was the leg of a mannequin lying on the bathroom floor. On closer examination, he realized that this was indeed a human leg, and the ashes that he had kicked in the basement moments before had to have been Dr. Bentley's incinerated body. He was aghast. Reported the incident, of course, immediately, and when his fellow firefighters arrived at that scene to, not believe what their colleague was telling them, he urged them not to go in. He said, this is too disturbing, this is too frightful, you don't want to see this. Of course, they didn't believe what he told them, so they one by one went in and came back shaking their heads and marveling about how one human being could have burned himself to this extent in an environment that was devoid of significant heat and flame damage. Now, let's be specific here. In Dr. Bentley's bathroom floor, it was covered with an aluminum flooring at the time, highly combustible material. Beyond the 2 by 3 foot hole through which his body had fallen and burned through, the linoleum did not catch fire. Directly above an edge of the hole through which his body immolated was a bathtub painted with enamel paint, not baked on, but painted enamel paint. We were at that fire scene. The paint did not even blister. Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker was lying askew above the hole through which his body immolated. The aluminum did not melt. Aluminum will melt at about 12 to 1300 degrees Fahrenheit. To consume a body in a crematorium to this extent, we are told, requires temperatures in the vicinity of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 uninterrupted hours.
Wow.
That statistic comes from Dr. Marion Krogman, who was involved in the Mary Reeser case that we've talked about already back in 1951, based on experiments that he did as an experimental scientist and forensic anthropologist using retorts and cadavers. 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 uninterrupted hours is what Dr. Krogman said was required to incinerate a body to the extent that Dr. Bentley left behind.
Jeez.
Directly above the hole through which his body immolated in the bathroom, the ceiling was untouched. We were there. We could stand. We were 6 feet tall, stretching our arm upright. We could touch the ceiling of Dr. Bentley's bathroom. Not a scorch mark on it. Unscorched paint next to the hole through which his body burned. Unmelted aluminum directly above the point through which the body combusted. The presence of a sweet odor in the apartment, akin to what was reported in the Mary Reeser fire scene many years earlier, all fit the parameters of what history has presented as classic spontaneous human combustion. For those who advocate the Wick theory, we challenge them. Replicate that fire scene in a burned chamber without using an accelerant, and we might begin to believe that you've dismissed the concept of spontaneous human combustion. However, we don't believe that can be done.
Right.
We've never seen it done honestly. We cannot do the experiment ourselves and create a fire scene like that. The mystery remains, and obviously a lot of questions come with that mystery.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely an interesting case. And that sparked a couple things just in listening. The first one is a common denominator, or two, that I've noticed in just listening to you now and researching a little bit on my own. One is it seems like a lot of the time there's a foot or a leg left over, and a lot of the time the people combusting are elderly people. Can you make anything of that? Is that true that that is somewhat common?
In the classic cases, yes, it is common. There is usually an extremity left behind, or a few extremities to indicate that pile of powder between the lower leg or the extended forearm or the shoulders and head once was, an actual human being, a person. Statistically, the elderly are more prone to this type of physical transition. And we do not find that particularly surprising as the human body ages. The mechanical, the biological systems in the body tend to break down. People become more diseased. So whatever is the mechanism or mechanisms that lead to spontaneous human combustion fire scenes, we would expect to find those conditions probably more prevalent in the elderly.
Sure.
That said, the youngest victim that we've been able to find in the historical literature that suggests spontaneous human combustion was a 6-week-old toddler in a crib.
Oh, wow.
Teenagers, people in their 20s and 30s can experience this phenomenon, and probably we're going to lead eventually into the subset of spontaneous human combustion, which is everything but classic, and that is those cases that have, A, been witnessed, and B, have been survived. There is such a thing as, we believe, partial spontaneous human combustion, in which a limb will smoke or blister or burn, but the person lives to tell the incredible tale of their partial combustion internally.
And have you found people and talked to people that have experienced that partial combustion?
We have indeed. We have been very privileged over the years of research to encounter more than 24 people now who have had the courage, first and foremost, the courage to speak about what has happened to themselves. And secondly, to have found people whose veracity and credibility we have absolutely no reason to doubt or to question, despite the bizarreness of the stories that they tell us. One of the survivors that we've encountered and have the privilege to know both as a survivor and as a friend is Peter Jones, who twice in one day in October 1980 witnessed his body bursting into plumes of smoke that came initially from his groin area as he was sitting on the edge of his bed, and the second time that day as he was sitting in his car and watched smoke billowing out of his forearms. The first time it was witnessed by his wife, who was as aghast and perplexed as was Peter Jones about where this smoke came from. They both looked for an external ignition source. There was none. The most dramatic case that we have so far of a survivor was also the first person that we were privileged to interview about this phenomenon. His name is Jack Angel, and his story very briefly is that in November 1974, he was a traveling salesman down south and parked his motorhome, which he used as a traveling showroom for the garments that he retailed, at a Ramada Inn in Savannah, Georgia. Went to sleep expecting to awaken the following morning to meet with some clients. He slept through the appointment. When Jack awakened finally, he discovered that his right forearm was charred black, burned to the bone, to use his phraseology. And yet the sheets on which he slept during that time were not singed. The pajamas that he wore during that time were not burned. His forearm burned black inside unburned pajamas. Figure that one out.
And
he got dressed, exited the motorhome, lost consciousness, and when he regained consciousness, he found himself surrounded by a team of medical experts at the Savannah General Hospital, all of whom were marveling about how their patient could have burned in the fashion that they were now examining. We've spoken at length with Jack Angel. We've spoken to two of his attorneys who were initially considering a lawsuit against the manufacturer of the motorhome, thinking that electrically or in terms of its plumbing, something had malfunctioned to cause Jack's severe burn injuries. They had to pull the case from the court 1 week before going to trial because, as they told us, they simply could not meet the burden of proof for the claims being made. Jack Angel is convinced, he told us, that the best explanation for his burn injuries is spontaneous human combustion, and that is backed up by the medical reports we have from his attending physicians who diagnosed the burn injuries as, quote-unquote, internal in origin. We have no way to assess that medical diagnosis other than to accept the premise that, by means presently unknown, Jack Angel burned from within, which is the very definition of spontaneous human combustion.
Right. Very, very intriguing. And you had mentioned that you also had cases where you had found witnesses and talked to witnesses. Are there any prominent examples of maybe in modern times somebody getting a cell phone video or something of this happening by chance, or even like a group of people witnessing it? Anything like that?
Yeah, one would, and this is one of the arguments that the naysayers invoke repeatedly, particularly now in this day of ubiquitous cell phone technology. Surely there must be footage of this happening. Well, we have only one known example where there was visual documentation recorded of a case of spontaneous human combustion, and we use the term rather loosely in this example. It comes from Italy. The name of the victim was Anna Moreno. It happened in the 1930s. And the story is that her breast would inflame, and this was supposedly filmed by her attending physicians. We would love, for several reasons, to see the footage of this. It must be quite remarkable. It has either been lost to history or destroyed or archived somewhere where nobody can find it to this day. We've often quipped that until someone such as the President of the United States or a leading candidate for the presidency of the United States suddenly erupts into a blazing inferno in front of a bank of microphones and television cameras,
right.
SHC will be continued to be denied, and only then will it be accepted as, oh, well, we knew this happened all along.
Of course.
The witness cases speak generally to the fire, and we use the term fire very loosely here because most of these cases of classic spontaneous human combustion and SHC quite broadly do not present themselves as an oxidizing fire. In other words, what happens when you strike a match. These cases appear to be better explained in terms of some kind of quasi-bioelectrical energy. Anyway, what is reported most often is that the victim is observed to become engulfed in a bright electric blue colored light or fire. and the best description we've had is to make it analogous to the color of flame that comes out at the end of a lit acetylene torch. Less frequently, we have reports of blue, blue-green, gold, white, silver-colored flames. But generally, what witnesses say they observe is this bright, brilliant, blue-colored fire, which, again, if it's an oxidizing fire, indicates an extremely high-temperature flame. But if it's something like ki or prana, kundalini, or bioelectrical energy, that's in line with expecting to see a blue color rather than the orange-red that we associate with oxidizing fire.
Right. And what is the frequency or, the chances, the ratio, if you have any numbers on when these occurrences happen, how often, how many times a year? I know it happens all across the globe, so do you have any kind of statistics on the frequency of spontaneous human combustion events?
Great question. We do indeed have cases from around the world. In fact, we have cases that fit the definition of spontaneous human combustion on every continent save Antarctica. And there aren't too many people down there, so that's not surprising.
Yeah.
In terms of statistics, the elderly are more prone to the phenomenon, as we said earlier, than is the general population. It was once said that all victims of SHC were elderly, female, alcoholic, overweight, and either lived in Germany or France. Our database, which consists now of more than 500 examples that fit the definition of the phenomenon, belie those statistics. In terms of gender, males and females are almost equally represented. Males are 50% of our database, males are 47%, and the remaining 3%, history simply does not record the gender. Many are smokers, yes. Many are alcoholics, yes, but many others are not. Some are sedentary, but some are, as was Jack Angel, quite active and mentally alert. Dr. Bentley, while semi-invalidic, was mentally acute and was well aware of his surroundings, not likely to be the victim of a smoking mishap.
Very cool. And I know that we kind of opened this talking about how modern science and medicine kind of ignores this, but I believe that in 2011, a coroner in Ireland said that a man named Michael Faraday, who died in December of 2010, they listed his cause of death as spontaneous human combustion. So I was wondering if there are maybe more recent cases of the medical world embracing or admitting this exists. And also you, I believe, just got back from Ireland doing some investigative work, so we'd love to hear any of your findings on the Emerald Isle.
Indeed, on the date that we were conducting this delightful conversation with you about this amazing subject, it's only been a few days since we have returned from Ireland. We have been in communication with Coroner McLaughlin, who was involved in the Michael Flaherty case, who went on public record as saying that Michael Flaherty in December of 2010 died by spontaneous human combustion. We are not yet willing to go to that extent simply because we have not seen the details of the original investigation. We have been unable to speak with the first responders of that case, despite being in Ireland and trying to track down, some of those individuals. Mr. McLaughlin refuses now to discuss the case further with us, although initially he was willing to talk to us by telephone for a few minutes. The local first responders acknowledged that there was an external ignition source in Michael Flaherty's fireplace, but they ruled out a connection between the embers in the fireplace and the body itself. We do not know the basis for which they made that determination, so we are a little skeptical. The one photograph we have seen of the fire scene is not sharp, so again, we're not willing to stake our research and our reputation on that case as spontaneous human combustion, although we have no reason to doubt McLaughlin's assessment that based on the appearance of the fire scene, that it fits what history has, termed SHC. There is another case in Ireland. McLaughlin also declared that this is the first such case in the country. That is not so. There are several cases that fit the concept of SHC that have occurred in Ireland. Speaking of frequency, following up on your earlier question, the greatest number of cases we have found for the phenomenon occur in the United Kingdom. Whether this is a result of the British press simply reporting these cases more honestly and accurately, that may be the case. It may also be that there are energies in that part of the planet that are more prone to ignite people and property than elsewhere to produce these extremely rare, and we emphasize rare events, but real nonetheless. The most recent case we're willing to stake our research and reputation on occurred more recently than the Flaherty case. It comes from eastern Oklahoma in February of 2013. The victim's name is Danny Van Zant. We spent several days with the first responders in eastern Oklahoma going over the facts of the case, and it is as dramatic, almost as dramatic a fire scene as was the Dr. Bentley case, the one that got us interested in this phenomenon to begin with. Very localized fire, absolutely befuddling and perplexing to the local authorities. Mr. Van Zant left behind at the fire scene his head, upper shoulders, his hands burned off at the wrists, and 2 feet and a heart. No other internal organs remained. No damage, heat, or flame to the ceiling overhead in what was a tinderbox of an environment.
Very, very intriguing. Bringing this sort of to a close, what do you foresee as the future of spontaneous human combustion? Are you finding more people are becoming open to the idea, to accepting, or at least admitting that this is happening to people? Or do you think it's sort of going to be an uphill battle of getting people to admit that this occurrence is occurring?
We're silently chuckling at that last question. Yeah, it's going to remain an uphill battle for some time until, as we said earlier, somebody before a bank of microphones and television cameras goes poof. It is an uphill battle. It's been a real struggle, and we thought we'd have made better progress, wedging away in our research, specifically the research that we've done into the mainstream fire and medical communities. The issue that you raised earlier about why the authorities are so reluctant, indeed adverse to dealing with the concept of true spontaneous human combustion. We'll never forget one fire marshal in Philadelphia when we went to get some fire files from his department on cases that we had in his jurisdiction. And he told us that there were no files to share with us because the phenomenon simply doesn't occur. We put photographs of Dr. Bentley on his desk, photographs of Mary Reese, who explained the situation and said, "You are the expert, sir. You're the fire professional. As a fire marshal, if you went to one of these fire scenes, you tell us, how would you explain it?" His response, one that we would never, ever forget, was this, quote unquote, "I'd go out, get drunk, and forget about it." You can deny the evidence, you can deny the phenomena, you can deny the photographs, but that doesn't make the denial honest.
Right.
If they, and anyone listening to this interview, wishes to know more about spontaneous human combustion and to overcome the rejection of mainstream science and orthodoxy to the phenomenon, you have to address this subject not with denial, but with a sense of discovery and awe.
Well said.
Once that happens, when that happens, and someday it must happen, because these cases are going to continue to occur, and as you alluded to earlier, someday someone's going to capture one of these on cell phone or some other means, and in which case it's going to become undeniable.
Right.
Only then will we begin to come closer to understanding what is the mechanism, what is the force or forces that undergird and underpin and can explain these infrequent but utterly fascinating means of human physical transition.
And if any of our listeners want to investigate this more, read more, get in touch with you, could you give out your website information, contact information, any titles of books, anything you have that people could do further investigation on their own and further research?
Absolutely delighted to do that for you. The website is ParaScience.com, PARA Science.com. Not the best website yet, but it'll at least get you in contact with us. The book is Ablaze, ABLAZE exclamation point, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion, available directly through us as a signed copy should you contact us by email or through Amazon and other leading providers. The email address is ParaScience2, P-A-R-A Science, the number 2, at Gmail. If you have questions, curiosity, suggestions, or ideally and ultimately leads to possible new cases for us to research and document and compare with our database, please get in touch with us.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the show and talking with you. Very educational, very informative. I want to thank you for taking the time, as well as thank you for all the research that you do and will continue to do to shine some light into this area of unexplored by the mainstream. But luckily, you're out there, sort of pioneering the field, so we appreciate that.
And we appreciate the honesty and forthrightness and graciousness with which you've conducted this interview and the provocative, profound questions that you've posed to us. Thank you in return.
Thanks so much. Cool. That's a wrap. Thank you again. That was fantastic.
Excellent. Let us know when you post it so we can link it to the website and others can tune in.
Absolutely. We'll definitely keep you posted. Thank you again. I'm glad we finally made it happen, and have a great weekend.
Us too. Thank you. Likewise. Good
Bye-bye.
day.